Hi everybody, Captain Al speaking on a Monday, 11 a.m. Central, and welcome to Ftd Pc Fs briefing number 2. And first let's see who's in the room. Welcome to my Patreon members. I see some people are here. And I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and we'll see who is in the room. At least for right now. Now we got 100% flight simmers, virtual pilots, no real world pilots, no aviation enthusiasts. So all flight simmers in the room right now. Disclaimer. Subsonic flight training tutorial briefings are for educational purposes only. The channel gives flight simulation gaming enthusiasts education for the purpose of enjoying their flight simulation experience greater by learning the jet aircraft operation. No portion of this training, though very accurate, is meant or intended for actual flight operations. No flows or checklists are to be used for actual flight operations. None of this material presented is approved for flight operations. It is intended for gaming use only. So if you can see the disclaimer video and you can hear my voice, give me a 1 in the chat box. Walter's usually the guy that does it, so there's usually only one person that gives me a 1, and that's Walter. So if you can hear me, give me a 1. Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Walter. Okay. So let's get started with the briefing. Before we do, I want to thank a couple of the Patreon members. Walter and Charles have submitted student videos. And I realize not everybody can submit student videos. It just depends whether you know how to do it. And Charles and I were talking about that and saying there's a learning curve to this. Just like there's a learning curve to me doing this and producing this live. So not everybody has the screen recording software. Not everybody knows how to put an unlisted YouTube video on. So the people that participate, again, it's completely optional. And I realize not everybody can necessarily do it or want to take the time to learn how to do it and put videos on. But thank you, Walter and Charles, for putting the student videos on there. And that's for everybody to view because everybody can learn from everybody else. This is lesson 2. And the lesson overview is that it's a local Boeing field flight. Again, we're going to practice flight deck preparation when we do the actual FTD lesson. Once we get to the runway, we're going to perform 3 different takeoffs. And then once we're airborne, we're going to go ahead and practice different auto flight modes. We'll look at the EFIS control panel and its operation. I think we'll look at the PFD and ND a little bit and describe some of the symbology on there, but most people are probably familiar with that. We'll also look at EFIS control panel alternate operations. And then we'll perform approach preparations and then proceed back into Boeing field for an ILS approach to an auto land. And then we'll do the all the after landing stuff once we're on the ground. The lesson objectives, we go there. So the lesson objectives for period 2 are to understand FMS CDU operation and pre-flight, to perform the 2 of the flow patterns, at least by memory, if you can do that. Take off with flight directors. Actually, there's going to be 3 takeoffs, so one of them will be raw data with no flight director. The other 2 will be with flight directors, one using heading select and flight level change, and the other one using LNAV and VNAV. And the first couple are for demonstration only, and then the third is really more of a normal takeoff. Again, we'll discuss the PFD and ND a little bit as we're airborne. And then we'll go to the practice area and kind of perform roll modes, pitch modes, and auto throttle modes, and talk about all the modes of operation. We'll look at the EFIS control panel, and the objective is to understand the EFIS control panel and also understand the EFIS control panel alternate operation if that were to fail. And then we'll set up the approach using the what we call the Y pattern in order to set up for the ILS approach, and then we'll perform an ILS approach to an auto land. And then we'll also, the objective is to understand the key points during the auto land. And then, of course, we will perform the after landing and the shutdown securing and electrical power down. As we get past the first couple of lessons, then I'll probably start the lesson with the airplane powered up. So for the first, 2 or 3 lessons, we usually do the, yeah, you're late, Steve. I was waiting for you to tell me to record. And I was going to say, where's Steve to tell me to push the record button? It is recording. And here's the flight plan for lesson 2, which is very similar to lesson 1, except now that we're going to fly it. Origin airport KBFI, destination airport KBFI. Runway 14 right is the departure runway. We'll be coming out of the Bravo 4 freestanding ramp position at Boeing Field. And we'll taxi out to 14 right, and then we'll depart. The flight plan will be Orton, direct Vamps, direct Payne, Victor 23 Seattle, which is what we put in last time. We'll do the Kent, I think it's the Kent 8 departure now. That Kent 4 is not current. I think the current one is Kent 8 departure, direct to Orton. And then we'll probably modify that direct to Vamps after the waypoint, I think it's Zigged. After Zigged direct Vamps, probably. Will be Sonic 4-4 Heavy. The planned zero fuel weight, 480,000 pounds. Fuel on board, 150,000 pounds. Gross weight, 630,000 pounds. Again, you can use kilos when you fly this yourself in your profile, because many of you are from Europe and or Asia, and you're probably used to kilos, and you probably use kilos and not pounds. Some European operators do use pounds, but not many of them. Cost reserves will be 20,000 pounds or 9 tons. Cost index 100. Cruise altitude will be 1,000. The thrust, we're going to actually modify the thrust. Just take note of that. We'll use TO2 and climb 2. That's going to work a little better for demonstrating these takeoffs. Things happen a little slower, and so you can talk through them a little bit easier rather than full-blown TO thrust. And since we're at a mid-range weight, certainly no need for full takeoff thrust. So we'll modify that to TO2 and climb 2 on the flight plan there. Be a flap 10 takeoff. We're going to use the NADP 2 procedure, which is 1,000 feet. Acceleration height. Engine out, we'll use 1,000 feet, and the thrust reduction flaps 5. And as we discussed last week, the NADP 1 would be the normal noise abatement departure profile, which would be the 3,000 foot acceleration height, and the thrust reduction at 1,500. And again, you'll see some of these lessons have that NADP 1, but many of them have NADP 2 just for training. That's usually what we use for training, but typically you're going to use the other one more, and that's the 3,000 foot acceleration height and the 1,500 thrust reduction. Wind 120, 10 knots, slope 0, CG will be 25%. Weather will be information Bravo, and the winds will be 130 at 12 knots, 15 statute miles, sky clear, temperature 10, dew point 4, altimeter 29 or 9 or 4, and the ILS 14, 14 right in use, ILS 14 right in use, departing 14 right, and we'll advise the initial contact you have Bravo. And then the clearance, when we get it, will be something like this: cleared to Boeing Field via local IFR, departing 14 right via the Ken 8 departure, direct probably VAMPS after Zigged, flight plan route. Climb maintain 6,000, expect 1,000 5 minutes after departure. Seattle departure 126.5, squawk 7474. So that'll be the flight plan. And then this is what the route of flight will look like coming out of Boeing Field, and this is the lesson events too, what happens at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth, approximately. And you'll see we're coming out on the Boeing Field on the Kent 8 to Zigged. Zigged has a restriction of 2,000, and when we get the clearance, we're just going to assume that ATC modifies that to 6,000, so we won't have that 2,000 foot restriction. We'll obey that later on as we go, but for the first initial lessons, we'll delete that 2,000 foot restriction via ATC, and we'll climb to 6,000. And then we'll probably modify it after Zigged to go direct VAMPS, and that'll bypass Orton. And then from VAMPS, it'll be direct to Payne. And then from Payne, it'll be radar vectors for the ILS 14 right. And so you can see there's six events. And if we go to the event list, this is what it will look like when we actually do the lesson. And that'll be that we'll do the electrical power-up procedure, we'll do the flight deck prep procedure. It's going to go faster this time. There's not going to be as much explanation, and I'm still going to go through it item by item, but not necessarily talk about it and go through quickly. And you can follow along, and then you can do it yourself when you do the lesson. Once we get to the end of the runway, we'll do the 3 takeoffs. One will be raw data, flight director's off, but we'll be using the auto throttle. The next takeoff will be flight director's on, using heading select and flight level change, simulating like VNAV is inoperative, and that we're flying runway heading for vectors. And then the third takeoff will be more of a normal takeoff where we use LNAV and VNAV, and we have the SID departure, the Kent 8, and we'll be using VNAV as the normal pitch mode we use for takeoff. So the third one will actually be more normal takeoff, and the first 2 will be demonstrated, or for demonstration purposes. Takeoff, we'll climb out once we're out of the area, and we do the checklist. After takeoff checklist, then we'll do some PFD and ND familiarization. We'll get to the practice area, that's number 4, and then we'll do the auto flight practice. And we'll look at all the roll modes, pitch modes, auto throttle modes, autopilot modes, and disengagement of those modes, including the auto throttle. And we'll look at the EFIS control panel, normal and alternate operation, and generally get a good workout on what the modes are and how they work. And we'll talk about that a little bit today too in the briefing. And then we proceed in for the get ready for the approach. So we'll go over the approach and landing preparation. We'll do the FMS CDUI pattern setup in order to get the CDU set up for the approach. And then we'll brief the ILS 14 right approach into Boeing Field. We'll get radar vectors for that approach, conduct that approach, and do it to an auto land. And then, once we after we land, we'll do the after landing procedure, shutdown and secure. Okay, so you should be seeing the Ftd Pc Fs 2 brief for today. Okay, so we're going to start this with the again with a dead airplane, unpowered, and we'll do the electrical power up procedure. After we do that, we'll adjust. Well, actually, I'll probably be in daylight, so we probably will forego the adjusting of the lighting. We talked about that in lesson 1. and that was good enough for that. So it'll probably be in daylight. So we won't necessarily have to adjust the lighting. We'll do the preliminary pre-flight procedure. We'll run through that. And then I'll do the CDU pre-flight. Once that's done, we'll do the first officer scan flow. At the completion of that, we'll do the captain scan flow. At the completion of that, we'll do the pre-flight checklist. Once that's complete, we'll get the EICAS. We'll pick up the EICAS information, which would be Bravo, and then we'll pick up the clearance for the local IFR in the Boeing field area. And then once we get our final papers, we'll set the MCP, and we'll do a crew briefing. Once that's complete, we'll check that the doors are closed and external powers are moved, and we're ready to go, and all the dispatch release is given, and so forth and so on. And then we'll do the before start procedure, followed by the before start checklist, and then we'll do an auto start on 4 and 3 and 2 and 1. And do the before taxi procedure, followed by the checklist, and then we'll taxi out, get clearance, taxi out. And then we'll do our items as we're taxiing out, and then accomplish the before takeoff checklist. And then, of course, we'll call the tower for departure clearance, or clearance to take off, and then we'll go ahead and line up, do the lineup items, and then we'll take off. So that's everything we covered on period 1. And again, it'll be the same, but it'll be a lot more rapid. Okay, so if the normal takeoff, let's discuss a normal takeoff first. Normally, when we advance the thrust levers, we're going to advance them to, on the GE engines, which is what we have, we're going to go to 70% N1 and stabilize. And then stabilization is just for a second, just to make sure the engines are spooled up and stable. And then we'll push the toga switch, either toga switch. For the captain, that would be his right hand on the thrust levers, and his right index finger would push the left toga switch. And for the first officer, that would be his left hand on the thrust levers, and his left index finger would push the right toga switch. But either toga switch will activate the toga mode. For the Pratt engines, it would be 1.1 EPR, stabilize, and then we would push toga. 1.1 EPR is a lot less movement than 70% N1. And 70% N1 will be bringing the thrust up to about the just under the N1 indicators on the primary EICAS. And you can see the thrust lever angle as you move the thrust levers. And so you can tell exactly more or less where to put that in order to get 70% N1. And same thing, you get used to it for EPR too, where to put the thrust angle. When you move the thrust levers, you'll see the little indicators on all 4 engines indicating the thrust lever angle. And that allows you to set the EPR before the power actually gets there. So for us, it'll be 70% N1, stabilize, push toga. You have to push toga by 50 knots ground speed, or the auto throttle will not engage. So if you kind of dilly-dally with it and take your time, and meanwhile we're kind of rolling down the runway, and we're trying to get the power set to 70% N1, and we're taking our time, and we reach 50 knots ground speed, the auto throttle would not engage at all. And in that case, you'd have to set manual thrust. Normally, once we set 70% N1, stabilize, and we push toga, the pilot flying would say set takeoff thrust. And then the pilot monitoring would make sure the thrust is set, but certainly by 80 knots. And we'll say thrust set once that thrust is set for takeoff. And it's verified by the pilot monitoring. The pilot flying is kind of, his attention is focused on, keeping directional control, and initially with the tiller. The captain would normally do that. Then as the speed increases, the nose wheel steering would operate via the rudder pedals. But then as you get to certain speed, around 40 to 60 knots, the rudder will become effective. And of course, the pilot flying is making sure that his attention is outside, so the pilot monitoring is going to be the one to make sure the thrust is set for takeoff, and he'll say thrust set. Again, we're going to verify the takeoff thrust is set, mainly the pilot monitoring's job, but the pilot flying will look at it as well, just to make sure it's set where you want it. Should be set by 80 knots. When we get to 80 knots, the pilot monitoring will say 80 knots, and then the pilot flying will say check. Then as we approach V1, the pilot monitoring will say V1. That's your takeoff decision speed. The hands would come off the thrust lever for the captain. Normally, if the first officer is flying, the first officer would initially set the power to 70% N1 and then push toga. And then as the thrust levers come up, the captain would take the thrust levers then, even though the FO is flying. They'd be his thrust levers, and then he would ensure that the thrust is set for takeoff. And at V1, the captain's hands are going to come off the thrust levers. So in both cases, if the captain's flying or if the first officer's flying, the captain's hands are on the thrust levers till V1. And then as we get to V1, his hands are going to come off the thrust levers. And now we've got that decision to continue with the takeoff, even if we have a problem. Pilot monitoring will say rotate, and he's going to say rotate usually 3 to 5 knots prior to rotate, because by the time it comes out of his mouth and you hear it and you do it, you're going to be at the rotate speed, if not a little beyond it. You'll see a lot of people will call rotate right at VR, and by the time he says it and by the time you do it, you're actually 5-10 knots above VR. So it's usually good to call that 3 to 5 knots prior to VR, because by the time you actually do it, you'll be at the rotation speed. And then, of course, the pilot monitoring would be looking for a positive rate. And he will say positive rate. And then the pilot flying will say gear up. The positive rate is determined by primarily the altitude indication starting to go up, not the vertical speed. You could still be on the ground and the vertical speed, well, you might see an initial climb with the vertical speed, but you could still be on the ground. So we confirm the positive rate really with the altitude indication moving up and not the vertical speed indicator moving up. The combination of the two would be good to call positive rate. So once you see that the vertical speed is moving up and the altitude is moving up, you can call positive rate. That's another thing you'll see sometimes is people will call positive rate and you're still on the ground. And that happens occasionally. So you do want to use that, and they're looking at the vertical speed primarily. Yeah, I've never seen an airline that uses go. I've never seen that where somebody says go instead of rotate. Yeah, there could be a case for that, where that's a shorter to say go than it is rotate. But I've never seen an airline use that. Lufthansa, okay, they use that. That's interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I've done some things with Lufthansa in Asia, but we weren't using their procedures. We were using, I think, China Airlines procedures, but they were there and we were there to help China Airlines standardize their procedures. But I don't think I've ever seen their procedures, Lufthansa, so that's interesting. Yeah, there's a case for that go is shorter than rotate. And the reason for that is because they've probably seen that problem where people call rotate and they do it a little right at the rotate speed. By the time it's out of your mouth, by the time he does it, you're 10 knots over rotation speed. And so we always say 3 to 5 knots prior, call rotate, and then by the time you do it, you're actually pretty close to it. Now, when we do it tomorrow or next week, the Mr. Sylvan, my first officer, who's the AeroWinks guy that'll make checklist callouts, and callouts. Checklist. He'll initiate the checklist, and he will also make callouts. And this is one area where he's not going to do it right because he will say positive rate gear up, and he says that all together, but he'll only do it after the gear is up. So it's not really realistic. So you're going to hear me say, when I have a positive rate, I'm going to say positive rate gear up, which is not the normal call out. But then we'll raise the gear, and then Mr. Sylvan, my first officer, Sylvan, will say positive rate gear up. Unless I program that. There's probably a way to program that, I think in AeroWinks, but I don't know what it is. But there's probably a way to change these call-outs, and sometime I wouldn't mind doing that. But he'll say positive rate gear up all as one sentence, and he'll do it after the gear is already up, which, doesn't help me really. So in order to kind of make that proper for us, I'm going to say positive rate gear up, and that will kind of cue Mr. Sylvan to put the gear up, even though I'm putting the gear up, not him. And then he'll say positive rate gear up. So it's a little non-standard there, but it's the only way we can make the call-outs work. In the QRH, there's a maneuver section that's kind of toward the back of the book. Sorry. And you will, in that maneuver section, you'll see a normal takeoff, and it'll be depicted as a graph or as a visual depiction here. And so you can read through that, but notice it says manually advance the thrust to stabilize. That'll again be 70% N1. We'll push toga. As you roll down the runway, you're going to maintain directional control with, if you're actually doing it, with the rudder pedals, and which controls the nose wheel steering. Initially, the captain will make sure the tiller's straight, and then the nose wheel steering will kind of take over. But once, it doesn't take very long before the rudder becomes effective, and then the rudder will maintain the directional control on the center line. And there'll be a slight forward pressure on the control column to make sure that the nose gear provides nose wheel steering in a positive way, especially early in the takeoff roll. So you would be holding a light forward pressure on that control column. We want to set the takeoff thrust by 80 knots. And again, when we get to V1, we would call, the pilot monitoring would call V1. And then some airlines, like Walter said, Lufthansa uses go. We use the term at Boeing, the Boeing procedure is called rotate, but some airlines will say VR, V1, VR, and again that's shorter too. So it just depends on what the standardized procedures are. For Boeing, it's the word rotate, and not VR. So V1, VR, and some airlines will even call V2, but the Boeing procedure is called V1, rotate, and positive rate, gear up. Positive rate of climb, again, will retract the gear, and again, that positive rate is determined by the altitude and the vertical speed, not just the vertical speed. And then above 400 feet, we could select or verify a roll mode. If we were flying runway heading for vectors, then we'd select heading select at 400 feet. If we're flying a SID departure, then LNAV will engage at 50 feet RA, and we would just make sure it's an LNAV by 400 feet. And then at 400 feet, VNAV would engage as well. It's not going to do anything yet, but it will engage at 400 feet. So that's why it says select or verify. We'll select it if we're flying a heading for vectors, and then that would be heading select. And we'll verify if we're flying a SID departure, and we have LNAV armed for takeoff, and then at 50 feet RA, LNAV engages. Once you rotate at about 2 to 2.5 degrees per second. That's a number, but it's a feel thing. It's just a nice, steady, smooth, slow rate of rotation, either up to the flight director, and then you should see your speed settle somewhere with all four engines between V2 plus 10 to V2 plus 25. It should be in that range. Anything in that range does not affect performance at all. And if you rotate too slow, That speed could be greater than V2 plus 25, but the flight directors will give you commands for V2 plus 25. If you rotate too fast, you could be a little below V2 plus 10. So the optimum rotation will give you a V2 10 to V2 25 speeds while you're climbing out. This diagram kind of shows NADP1 at the thrust reduction height, which on NADP1 would be 1,500 feet. That's where we'd verify climb thrust. And then at the acceleration height, which comes after that with NADP1, would be 3,000 feet. And then we'd accelerate to retract the flaps on schedule. But we're going to use 1,000 feet, and this is NADP2. We're going to use 1,000 feet for acceleration, so that's going to happen. The acceleration is going to happen before the thrust reduction, and then we'll use flaps 5 for the thrust reduction. So the 1 is more for noise abatement. That's the number 1. And then the number 2 is when noise abatement isn't as much of a factor. And then you'll notice that we can limit the bank angle to 15 until you're above your flap up plus 20 knots. We're not going to talk about non-normal checklists right now. We're verifying continuous thrust with an engine in op. And once the flaps are up, we would do the after takeoff checklist. You can engage the autopilot when you're above the minimum minimum altitude for autopilot engagement. That's 250 feet in the 400. And the Dash 8, I think, is 200 feet. 200 feet in the Dash 8 and 250 in the 400. And typically in the FTD, we engage the autopilot at 250 feet because most of the time you don't even have a control column. You're in the actual FTD, at least in the 747. The 787, I think, does have a control column that you could actually take off. But the 747 usually does not have rudder pedals or a control column. You're just kind of sitting there in a seat in front of the panel. And the instructor will push a button for the auto takeoff. And so that when you add the power and you push toga and it gets to VR, it's going to rotate automatically. And then it kind of stabilizes itself. But at 250 feet, we would get on the autopilot. And so we're going to, obviously do that here as well. There's no value in hand flying it, except the first takeoff will be hand flown because there's no flight director on. And the second takeoff and the third takeoff, I'll probably get the autopilot on a little bit earlier, but probably a little bit more than 250 feet. But typically in the FTD scenarios, the autopilot will come on as soon as we can get it on because the whole profile is flown using the auto flight system, including the auto land. Let's see. And you can see the note up there for an immediate turn after takeoff. Maintain your initial climb speed with takeoff flaps while maneuvering and follow the AFDS bank limits. There's usually no turns below 400 feet, but above 400 feet, if you had to make an immediate turn, you could. Looks like when I converted this to PowerPoint, this messed up a little bit. The rate of rotation, again, is 2 to 2.5 degrees per second. Usually no more than 3 degrees per second. We used to say 3 degrees per second all the time. Then it really changed more to 2 to 2.5 degrees per second. And at this mid-range weight, we're probably going to be about 18 to 20 degrees of pitch. So when we do the raw data takeoff, that's what I'll be rotating to, is that 18 to 20 degrees of pitch. If you're heavy, it's going to be more like 15 degrees of pitch. If you're lighter, it's going to be more like 18 to 20. Usually, certainly not more than 20, and probably not less than 15 or 14 or something like that if you're heavy. Again, we're going to climb at V2 plus 10 to V2 plus 25. That's the normal range. If you rotate normally, you should be somewhere in that range. And again, the range does not affect your performance at all. The range is, or the performance is predicated on that being somewhere between those two speeds. We're using NADP2, so at 1,000 feet, acceleration height. I'm going to reduce the pitch to 10 degrees. Again, this is the first takeoff, which is auto throttle only. Flight directors are off. I'm taking off. We're going to use the auto throttle, so I'll add the power to 70% N1, stabilize, push toga, roll down the runway, rotate at that optimal rotation rate, and then the pitch will immediately then continue. It's a continuous rate of rotation up to that 18 to 20 degrees of pitch. So if you're doing, 2.5 degrees per second, 2 degrees per second, you're probably looking at about 7 seconds after you start to rotate, somewhere in that range, 7 to 8 seconds to get to 18 to 20 degrees of pitch. And I'll be doing that raw data just off the PFD because there's no flight directors to follow. And then once we get to that pitch attitude, I'll hold that pitch attitude, and I'll be monitoring my speed to make sure it's not dropping off or accelerating. And then I'm somewhere in that range, V2 to V2 plus 10 to V2 plus 25. Then when I get to 1,000 feet, I'm going to reduce the pitch to 10 degrees, and that's for acceleration, because that's where I want to start my acceleration. But I have to do it manually because there's nothing on to tell me to do it automatically, so I have to lower the pitch to do that, to accelerate. And as the speed increases, once you get to your flap 5 speed on the PFD, I'll call for flaps 5 thrust. And then I'll also say set speed 250. Now what that does is we're at our thrust reduction point, but the thrust is not going to reduce automatically like it would do if we were using VNAV. You can kind of think of a VNAV as like a completely automatic transmission on a car. Everything's works automatically. But if you don't have an auto transmission, you might have a stick, and of course you have to push the clutch in and put it in gear and things like that. And it's the same thing here. We have to, if we're not using VNAV, then we have to do things manually, and we do that by pushing the thrust button. The thrust button will change the takeoff thrust, in this case TO2, because that's what we're going to use, and it'll change it to climb 2. And so we're doing that manually in order to get the climb thrust set. And then after we do that, we can set the speed to 250 knots in preparation that I'm going to be pushing the speed button in order to get the auto throttle into the speed mode in order to hold 250 knots. So we can bug the speed up, as we get to this point, we can bug it up. And of course, I'll be trying to do this all with, flying the airplane and my left hand trying to get to the mouse, and there's no first officer to help you here. And then we'll retract the flaps on schedule, flaps 1, flaps up, and then as the flaps are up and the speed's increasing, that's cut off at the bottom. I can't get that. I changed these over from Keynote, which is an Apple product, to PowerPoint, and sometimes the slides get a little messed up when you do that. And then I moved it to this computer. This isn't my Apple computer, this is a PC computer. So when you go flaps 5 thrust, that sets you, that will reduce the thrust to climb 2. We retract the flaps, and then as we're increasing the speed, we'll say auto throttle speed mode. And that'll take us out of thrust reference and put us into the speed mode so that the auto throttle will retard in order to hold the speed of 250. And then once the flaps are up, we can call for the after takeoff checklist. You might not be able to see it there, but it says call for the after takeoff checklist when the red boxes have disappeared on the PFD. You can look over at the flap indicator and see when the flaps are up, but if you don't want to look away, you could just continue looking at your PFD. And when you see the red boxes all of a sudden disappear, they kind of go up on the display and disappear. That's when the flaps are fully up. So it's just a cue you can use instead of looking over at the flap indicator. And you're keeping your attention on the PFD anyway. But of course, you could look over the flap indicator. Nothing wrong with that. But a little technique is to look at the PFD red boxes, and as soon as they disappear, the flaps are up at that point. So that's what we're going to do on the first takeoff, and that's just for demonstration purposes only. Of if you were to use raw data, it's not a normal takeoff, but if you were to use it, kind of just emphasizes the pitch required for a lighter weight, and then the use of the thrust button in order to change from automatic, or in order to change from takeoff thrust, TO2 to climb to, because you have to do that manually, and then getting the speed up to 250, and then going to the speed mode because you have to, because if I level off and the auto throttle is not in the speed mode and it's in thrust reference, the speed is just going to run away. There's no speed control. It will just go 250, 260, 270, 280 until I do something about it, which should be disconnect the auto throttle and pull back the thrust levers. But if it's in thrust reference, we need to get it into the speed mode, and that's what we'll do. So the first part of this is just a demo only. The second takeoff is a little more realistic. If VNAV were not to work, if VNAV was somehow inoperative, and we're flying runway heading radar vectors for XYZ waypoint, then we would use heading select and flight level change as the roll mode and the pitch mode on takeoff. This time the flight directors will be on. We would do the same things, set 70% N1, stabilize, push toga, roll down the runway, keep directional control with rudder. Again, initially it'll be the nose wheel, but then the rudder will be active at 40 to 60 knots. And then we'll V1, rotate, positive rate, gear up. And then at 400 feet, we'll go to heading select. And that'll take us out of toga. Remember, we have blank toga on takeoff and FD for the autopilot flight director engaged status. And so at 400 feet, we'll select a roll mode, which in this case will be heading select, because we were given a clearance to fly runway heading for radar vectors for ABC waypoint. And using NADP1 again, 2, we're going to accelerate at 1,000 feet. So at 1,000 feet, we're going to have to get into a pitch mode because we're still in toga for pitch. And so again, this is the whole manual thing versus automatic. VNAV would do it for us automatically. Flight level change, we have to select it. So we'll go at 1,000 feet, we'll go flight level change, set speed 250. And that will engage our pitch mode. And that will also then give us commands on the flight director to accelerate to 250 knots. Now, it could also be more than 250 knots depending on what your weight is. So I think at 630,000 pounds, I think it's probably 253 knots because of the weight. It's a little bit above 250. If you were heavy, you might see 280 knots, 282 knots, something like that. So you can, obviously, the heavier you are, the more the speed is going to be above 250, and we would normally have to get that departure clearance to make sure they know that we're requesting a higher speed due to operational requirements above 10,000 feet. So normally the restriction is 250 below 10, but if we're a heavy aircraft, we need more than that. And so ATC is used to the fact that an airplane coming out at the same time, on the same day, every day, that's going from Narita to Detroit, let's say, they know he's going to be heavy. And so they know you're going to need more than 250 knots, but we still have to tell them. We need, more than 250 for operational requirements. And then he'll say high speed approved. And then you can maintain that. But tomorrow it'll be probably, or next week, it'll be probably, I think it's around 253 knots, so I'll probably just set 250. It's close enough. And then as we accelerate, we'll retract the flaps, and when the speed reaches the flap position on the speed display, we'll retract the flaps to 5, and then to 1, and then to up. At flaps 5 speed, again, we're going to have to manually get climb 2 thrust. So in order to do that, we're going to say flaps 5 thrust, just like we did on the raw data takeoff, because the thrust will not change from TO2 to climb 2 automatically like it would in VNAV. So we have to do it manually. And then we continue to retract the flaps on schedule, and then we would call for the after takeoff checklist. Again, when the red boxes disappear on the PFD, that's a good technique. Again, you can look over at it if you want on the primary EICAS to see that they're up, but you'll notice if you do that, look at the boxes too, and you'll see they just disappear when the flaps reach the up position. Okay, where was I? Okay, so let's talk about this third takeoff. The third takeoff is a LNAV and VNAV takeoff. And this is more typical because, well, you may or may not have a SID departure. That just depends on if it's part of your flight plan or not, or you get it as part of your clearance or not. But at most major airports, yeah, you're probably going to have a SID departure. And then you're going to use VNAV for takeoff. So this is a more normal takeoff. And once we get positive rate gear up, at 50 feet RA, you will get LNAV engaging automatically. That's assuming that you had LNAV armed, and assuming that you have an active flight plan, and assuming you're above 50 feet RA, then LNAV will engage automatically at that point. At 400 feet, VNAV will engage automatically. Now, it really doesn't do anything at 400 feet until you get to your acceleration height or until you get to your thrust reduction point. Then it will do some things. But when it engages at 400 feet, it's really not doing much. It just engaged. But in our case, with the NADP2 procedure, at 1,000 feet, the flight director then will automatically start to command acceleration for flap retraction. And how did it know that? Because you programmed it on the takeoff reference page. And because VNAV was armed on takeoff, and then VNAV engaged at 400 feet automatically, and now at 1,000 feet, it kind of triggers the fact that, okay, I need to accelerate for flap retraction. And so it sends a command to the flight directors to give you that command to follow the flight director if you're hand flying, or the autopilot to follow the flight director and accelerate for flap retraction. And then when we retract the flaps, when we go from flaps 10 to flaps 5, there's no need to push the thrust button now because it happens automatically. So thrust will change from takeoff to climb now. In our case, takeoff 2 to climb 2 will happen automatically, and which is great because all we have to do is verify it. And then we'll continue to retract the flaps on schedule, and then we'll call for the after takeoff checklist again when the flaps are up and you see the up indication, or when the red boxes disappear on the PFD or whatever you prefer to do there. And then we would do the after takeoff checklist, the pilot monitoring. So those are the 3 takeoffs we're going to do. Raw data, first one with the auto throttle. Second one, heading select and flight level change. And third one, LNAV and VNAV, which is more typical. Then once we get out to the area, we'll probably look at some of the symbology on the PFD and the ND, and I'm not going to go over that now, but and then we'll get into the local practice area there, and then start doing some exercises. And we'll first look at the roll modes, and then we'll look at the pitch modes, and then we'll look at the auto throttle modes and autopilot modes. So the roll modes are heading select, heading hold, and LNAV. And we'll demo each one of those on the lesson next week. Heading select, which is in the middle portion here of your flight mode enunciation. Of course, remember again, you've got auto throttle here, you've got roll mode here, and you've got pitch mode here. And then you have the autopilot flight director engaged status here. And in this case, heading select, as you guys probably know already, again, this is pretty basic if you've been fooling around with this airplane, heading select will fly you to the selected heading. Now, if you're in heading select already, like we are here, let's say at the 12 o'clock position, we're in heading select. When you rotate the mode control panel heading selector, the heading select, when you spin it, the airplane will turn the direction you spin it because you're in heading select already. So if you turn it to the right, the airplane's going to turn to the right. If you turn it to the left, the airplane's going to turn to the left. And heading select remains engaged. And in this case, there wouldn't be a green box around here. There wouldn't be a green box because that's, again, that indicates a new mode. And we'd already be in heading select. So again, this would disappear after 10 seconds. You'd have heading select there. You're at 12 o'clock. You want to turn to the right, spin the heading bug to the right. The airplane turns to the right. Spin the heading bug to the left. The airplane turns to the left. If you're in anything other than heading select, so if you're like in LNAV or you're in heading hold or whatever you're in, doesn't matter, anything other than heading select, and now you reach up and you spin your heading bug to whatever heading you want, and then you push the heading select button on the mode control panel, the little momentary action button that's in the switch, the airplane will turn the shortest direction to that heading. So in this case, it's a left turn, and the system knows that. It knows that you are in a mode other than heading select, and now you're pushing heading select, and it kind of looks at where you are and where the heading bug is and what's the shortest direction to get there. And in this case, it's going to be a left turn, so it's going to make a left turn to that heading. When you're in heading select, this is different than some earlier generation airplanes and most later generation airplanes. This would be the norm. If you're in heading select and you spin the heading bug past 180 degrees, the airplane will turn past 180 degrees. In some airplanes, it would turn back the other way. Now it would go left. If you were to spin it more than 180 degrees, it would start turning back to the left. Not the case in these airplanes. When you turn more than 180 degrees, it will turn more than 180 degrees. So if you go from a heading of north, let's say here, and you're going to a heading of 250, then and you spin it to the right, the airplane's going to turn all the way to the right to a heading of 250. In fact, you could keep spinning this heading bug all the way up here, like where it is right now. If you spun it all the way around, the airplane would make a 360. As long as you don't cross this track line. The track line is the white line right here. And of course, this is your heading bug. So if I were to spin this all the way around and I don't cross the track line, the airplane would turn all the way around, 360. As soon as I cross this track line with a heading bug, the turn would stop. It would sense that, okay, I'm just turning now because you passed the track line and I'm going to roll out right now. So you can make any turn more than 180 degrees as long as you don't cross the track line. As soon as you cross the track line, all bets are off. It's just going to roll wings level then. Heading hold is another roll mode, not used as frequently. Heading select is used a lot, obviously, because you're flying headings that are required by ATC. Heading hold has its uses, but they're more limited. Heading hold, when it is selected, when you push the little alternate action switch on the mode control panel, the airplane will go into the heading hold mode, which again is shown on the right here. You're not seeing, oh, there you are. Now you're seeing it. I had that same problem before. Okay, it's right here. The heading hold indication is right here. Again, thrust, roll, pitch. Heading hold. So heading hold will hold your heading. That's all it does. If you're in level flight, it's just going to hold the heading that it has when you go into heading hold. If you happen to be in a turn, like we are here, let's say we're in heading select and we turn the heading bug to the right, and now we're turning to the right, and at the little X here is where I push heading hold. Well, the airplane will simply roll wings level and then hold that new heading that it has at wings level. So it doesn't go back to where you push the button, in other words. It will go into heading hold, but it's going to roll wings level and then hold that heading. So if you did want this point right here, you'd have to reselect the heading bug and then go back to heading select in order to make it go back to here. So again, push heading hold right here. It's going to roll wings level. It's going to continue turning, obviously, because it's not wings level yet. And then when it gets here, it'll hold that selected heading. Now, when would you ever use heading hold? Well, you know, one example would be if you're in LNAV and you're flying from point A to point B to point C, waypoints, and your heading bug doesn't automatically keep up with you. You have to set the heading bug to course. So when you're going to point A, you have to put the heading bug out in front of you. And then when the airplane turns to point B, you have to change the heading bug in front of you again. It doesn't keep up like the Airbus does. Airbus, the heading bug kind of matches. But in LNAV, the heading bug will lag because we have to manually keep it in front of us. Well, if you forgot that, which sometimes happens, you know, people don't necessarily, you get in the habit of doing this, but, you know, you could forget. And then the heading bug might be behind you and to the left, let's say, because you forgot to spin it up to the new heading for the waypoint that you're going to. And a call comes in from ATC and says, turn right to a heading of 040. But the heading bug is behind you to the left, and we're supposed to turn right. And you just reach up blindly and you push heading select. And the airplane turns the shortest direction, which would be a left turn, to that heading that's behind you. And so the airplane starts turning left. And then you're like, what the heck's going on? That's a good reason for heading hold. Because now you can just reach up there, push heading hold. That will stop the turn. You can spin the heading bug, and right away you're going to see where it is. And then you can spin the heading to 040, and then you can go back to heading select, and now the airplane will turn to the right, the shortest direction. So that's a use for heading hold. There's some other uses too, like if you're approaching a waypoint, and I won't go into those, but there are a couple other uses that you could use heading hold for. Most of the time, you're not using it. That's one of those buttons that, you know, on a line flight, you could not push that at all. It would be probably pretty normal not to push that. But that's the one big case I can think of using it is when you turn the wrong way, and you want to stop the turn and say, well, ooh, I forgot to set my heading in front of me. Then you just reach up, push heading hold real quick, spin the heading bug the way you want it, and then go to heading select, and now it turns the proper direction. LNAV would be the other roll modes. So the roll modes are heading select, heading hold, and LNAV. Two of these you're using quite frequently. LNAV, obviously, we're using that a lot because once we're on course, and if ATC doesn't change our course, and we programmed our course, and we're flying our course as programmed, then we're going to be in LNAV for most of the flight. But once ATC starts to, yank us off the flight plan route in order to radar vector us, let's say, for an ILS approach, in that case, then we're going to go to heading select. So heading select and LNAV are used the most. Most of the time you're in LNAV, and then heading select you're in when ATC, when it requires it, when you have to fly a selected heading. So LNAV allows you to fly your programmed route, in this case, present position direct to pane, Papa Alpha Echo, and then after pane would be ABC. And I forgot to make this white. This should be up here. This should be white, not magenta. Now, only the active waypoint is magenta, and all other waypoints are white. I forgot to change that. And whenever you're in LNAV, the heading bug, and let's say that now this heading bug should be up here. It should be straight ahead of you. So this is an example, like if ATC said, again, turn left to a heading of 320, and I just reach up and I push heading select, the airplane's going to turn right because the heading bug's over here. And that's when I could push heading hold and then spin the heading bug over here and then push heading select. And part of the problem of that is that, if you call it a problem, but when you're in LNAV, this dashed line will disappear after you get into LNAV. So let's say we just got into LNAV, we went present position direct to pane, we got a green attention box around there for 10 seconds, and you're going to see that number 1 here will go to number 2. This dashed line, magenta line, will disappear, and then all you have is the little heading indicator on your compass arc. So that's what makes it a little difficult to spot where the heading is, unless you move the heading. And as soon as you move the heading bug, this comes back, the dashed line. You'll see where it is. So it's a lot easier to see it when you see the dashed magenta line. But in LNAV, that disappears, and that's what contributes to you not seeing that the heading bug is not in front of you, because you don't see that magenta line, the dashed magenta line. So again, anytime you're in LNAV, this line will disappear, and it'll look like that, like number 2. Okay, those are the roll modes. The only thing I didn't mention, and we'll mention it when we do the exercises, is the bank angle limit selector, which only applies to heading select. And you'll notice that bank angle limit selector is on the heading select knob. And so LNAV uses its own bank logic. It's going to use whatever it deems as necessary to turn, not exceeding 30 degrees, but it uses its own logic to determine what bank angle to turn at. Whereas heading select will use the bank angle that you have selected on the mode control panel. And that can vary from auto to 5 to 25. And in auto, it will provide a bank angle of between 15 to 25 degrees, depending on your speed. So the higher your speed is, the less the bank angle will be. It'll be more like 15 degrees. And the lower your speed, the slower your speed, the bank angle will increase. So then it can increase up to 25 degrees, or anywhere in between, 15 to 25, if you're in auto. If you take it out of auto, now you're going to get whatever you selected, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Whatever that's in is what your bank angle is going to be. So most of the time we leave it in auto, obviously. We don't, unless we require a shallower bank angle for some reason. And again, that only applies to heading select. Obviously, heading holds your selected heading, so that has nothing to do with a turn. And LNAV uses its own logic, so that bank angle limit selector is only applicable when you're in heading select. The pitch modes are vertical speed, flight level change, altitude hold, and VNAV. And again, we're going to demo those in next week's lesson as well. Again, the ones that you use the most would be VNAV, flight level change. Altitude hold would be a function of getting into it automatically. Usually you're going to capture an altitude, and the airplane will go from whatever pitch mode you're in to altitude hold, or to VNAV alt, or whatever you're, it's usually an automatic function as opposed to you manually doing it. Vertical speed has its uses, but they're limited. There are times when you need to hold a specific vertical speed, and then you can do it, and as long as that vertical speed is reasonable and it can maintain your speed that's on the mode control panel, then there's no danger of vertical speed. The problem comes when you use vertical speed with an improper vertical rate, and then there can be no speed control and no protection either. So vertical speed is a mode that we use, but very sparingly, and sometimes not at all. Flight level change we obviously use mainly in the descent, not so much in the climb, because in the climb, after takeoff, we're using VNAV. And VNAV provides the most optimal profile to getting up to your cruise altitude. And then we stay in VNAV during cruise, and we stay in VNAV as long as we can during the descent, because it provides an optimal profile for the descent. But usually at some point, unless you're flying a star and you're complying with restrictions along the star, at some point ATC may take you off and then start vectoring you, and now you're off the LNAV VNAV profile, in which case a lot of times there's no economy to using VNAV, in which case you would transition to flight level change for the rest of the descent. So we stay in VNAV as long as we can during the descent, but at some point we're probably transitioning to flight level change. Again, maybe not. Depends if we're going to fly the star right to our approach and go right into the approach, then we may not come out of VNAV. But that's not normally the norm. The norm is that ATC is going to yank you off and vector you. So vertical speed would show up in the, there's my pointer. Vertical speed would show up right here in the pitch enunciation. When you're in VS, you'll notice again that anything you select on the mode control panel, you're going to see on the PFD. So you can see here that the selected, and they're in magenta. So the altitude here is set to 2800 on the mode control panel. That little half indicator right here is the altitude of 2800. It's off scale, so you can only see half of the actual indicator because 2800 is not on the scale right now. You can see the heading bug set to 031, that's a magenta, and there's your little heading indicator. And then the airspeed is 250, and that's a magenta. So you got 250 set in the window on the MCP, you got 031 set in the heading window, and you got 2800 set on the altitude. So anything in magenta on the PFD is what you have set on the MCP. Anytime you're in vertical speed, you'll also notice there's a little kind of equal sign here in magenta, and that's showing what your current vertical speed is set at, in this case 1,000 feet a minute down. And when you go into vertical speed, then it will maintain that specific vertical speed. And so the elevator is pitching to give you 1,000 feet a minute. The auto throttle is going to maintain your speed of 250 if it can. At 1,000 feet a minute, it can. That's not unreasonable. You start to go to 1,500 feet a minute, you start to go to 2,000 feet a minute, you start to go to 3,000 feet a minute, then the pitch, the elevator is going to pitch to maintain what you're telling it to do, which is 2,000 feet a minute, 3,000 feet a minute. And now the speed, it can only do, one of two things. It can either go to idle or it can go to the reference thrust. It can't go any more than that. So if you're calling for, 3,000 feet a minute vertical rate down, the power is going to come back to idle, but that's all it can do. So now the speed is going to start increasing. And if it got up to barber pole, it could overspeed. There's no protection in vertical speed. That's one of the problems why we don't like to use it. That's one of the things. There's multiple, but one of the things is it has no speed protection. The other is it doesn't necessarily maintain the speed like VNAV or flight level change would. It could increase, it could decrease. So those are some of the issues with vertical speed that you have. So you'll see here that in a vertical speed climb, like we're showing here, and we're using, let's say, that 1,000 foot per minute again, and we're climbing at 1,000 feet a minute, and again, I don't have the MCP here, but we've pushed vertical speed button, the light bar illuminated. This says vertical speed VS. Green attention box for 10 seconds, and you take the thumb wheel and you spin it up to 1,000 feet a minute. Well, the auto throttle is going to increase the power to hold your speed at 250. And it can do that just fine because you're calling for a reasonable vertical rate up, and it can add power, and it's not anywhere close to the reference thrust, whatever that is. Let's say climb 2 or climb 1 or climb whatever it is. But again, if you call for something that's a little unreasonable, like in this case, 3,500 feet a minute, we spin it up to that, and the airplane, the elevator pitches to maintain 3,500 feet a minute, the power will increase up to the reference thrust, which let's say is, climb 1 or climb 2 in our case. It can't go any further than that. So what's going to happen to the speed? It's going to start doing this. It's going to start dropping from that 250 knot commanded speed, and it'll start dropping, and it could go below the up bug, and it could go below, keep decreasing. And when it gets to the red boxes, or the minimum maneuvering speed, and then to the red boxes, you could get a stall. You'll get buffet, and then you get a stall. It can go into a stall. There's no protection, in other words. So you can overspeed the airplane, you can underspeed the airplane when you're in vertical speed and you're using an improper vertical speed. So no speed protection. And that's why we don't like to use it as a normal pitch mode. Here we are in the descent, the vertical speed descent. So again, you go to vertical speed, you push the vertical speed push button on the MCP, light bar illuminates in the switch. You get VS here, green detention box for 10 seconds. You take the thumb wheel and you go to 1,000 feet a minute down. The elevator will pitch for 1,000 feet per minute down. The auto throttle will reduce the power to keep you at 250 knots. And it can do that because it's within the normal range between idle thrust and your reference thrust. So no problem, as long as this is kind of a reasonable figure. But if we start to say, well, I need more than that, so I start to go to 2,000 feet a minute, well, now you're going to start to have a little bit of a problem because the elevator will pitch for 2,000 feet a minute, and again, the power will come back to idle, but the speed will be allowed to increase. It has to increase because the auto throttle's done its job. It can only do its job to idle or the full reference thrust or somewhere in between. But in this case, the speed will start to increase, and now we have no speed. I won't say protection, but we can't control the speed, and the speed will be allowed to increase. And if it continues to increase, and we get to barber pole, you could overspeed the airplane. So again, big thing here: no speed protection when you're in vertical speed, and that's why we don't use it. We used to use this, when we were doing non-precision approaches. And we were using, it was a vertical speed non-precision approach. And early on, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we used to dive and drive. We used to use vertical speed to get down to the altitude, the next altitude, and then dive and drive to the next altitude. And then you would, from the final approach fix in, you'd go down, I forget what it was, maybe 1,500 feet a minute, and then you'd back it off to 1,000 feet a minute, and then you would push altitude hold at the MDA. So we used to use vertical speed for non-precision approaches, and then we went to vertical speed constant angle non-precision approaches. Then we went to VNAV non-precision approaches, which is kind of where we're at now. Or if you're in the Dash 8, the IAN approaches, the integrated approach nav. But there we had more of the use of vertical speed because we did use it for a non-precision approach. But nowadays we don't, because they're VNAV non-precision approaches. So the uses are more limited. But, there's some places where you have to come out and it may be more advantageous to go into vertical speed. I think coming out of Frankfurt, and I haven't come out of there a lot, but I think there's some cases where coming out of London, sometimes they want you to reduce your rate, and you may have to, it may be good to just use vertical speed to do that instead of messing with, VNAV gives you the full reference thrust, and if you go to flight level change, you kind of have to adjust the thrust levers. So if you need a specific rate, then vertical speed can be used, and there's some cases more in Europe than in the States where you may use vertical speed in order to comply with what ATC wants you to do. And that's usually going to be less of a vertical rate because they want you to reduce your rate to fit in with all the other threading of aircraft that they have coming in and out of London or in and out of Frankfurt, things like that. So do we use vertical speed? Yeah, in some situations. What's a use for vertical speed? I can think of one. There's probably more than one, but I can think of one right off the top of my head. You're on an ILS approach, and you arm the localizer, and you capture the localizer. And let's say you haven't armed the approach yet. You just capture the localizer. And now, after you capture the localizer, you're going to go ahead and arm the approach and to get the glide slope armed. Well, you forget to arm the approach, and now the glide slope starts coming in. You go gear down flaps 20, and now the glide slope captures. You go flaps 30, but you forgot to arm the approach. So now the glide slope, we're going high on the glide slope. And now we've got no capture on the glide slope. That's a use for vertical speed, because now you can, when you recognize that, you can open the VS window, you could spin your altitude down or get it out of the way. You just want to make sure it doesn't capture again. You could push the vertical speed open. You could bring it to 1,500 feet a minute, and you can start to descend in order to capture the glide slope. And you're probably going to need more than 1,000 feet a minute to do that. And you're at flaps 30 at that point. The speed's not going to increase all that much at 1,500 feet a minute. So you'll increase the descent rate to kind of catch up with the glide slope. And now you've armed the approach, and now the glide slope will capture. And now you're out of vertical speed when that does that. That's a use for vertical speed because you screwed up. You forgot to arm the approach. You go high on the glide slope. And now I say, whoops, and I, open the vertical speed window and spin in. Now, what can happen if you don't get the altitude window out of the way? It can capture the altitude window again, and that's a real mess. And sometimes that happens, and people are, well, tell them we need to, vectors to go back for the, So there's cases where you have to kind of know what you're doing on the mode control panel in order that you don't recapture an altitude. And but that's a use for vertical speed, a practical one, because you messed up not arming the approach. But a more normal mode to use is flight level change. And again, mostly in the descent, not so much in the climb. Well, we talk about both here. When you're in a flight level change climb, you're going to get two changes on the FMAs. You're going to get a thrust change, and you're going to get a pitch change. So it's not only one mode that changes, it's two modes that change. It's the thrust mode and the pitch mode change when you go to flight level change. Right now, this has been in flight level change more than 10 seconds, so the green attention boxes have gone away. And what flight level change does in the climb is that it's got some logic in there where it attempts to get you there in 2 minutes. So if you're going from 9,000 feet to 13,000 feet, and let's say we're going to use flight level change, maybe we're in the local area and we don't necessarily want to use VNAV because VNAV goes to thrust reference, and it goes to the reference thrust, and it's going to go all the way up to your full climb thrust. And, I'm only going from 9,000 to 13,000. Whoops, I forgot a zero there. This should be 13,000. So you may not necessarily want VNAV because it kind of goes balls to the walls. It goes thrust reference, it goes all the way to your reference thrust, elevator pitches to maintain the speed, and off you go. And you're only going 4,000 feet. So you can use flight level change sometimes in a situation in a climb where you don't necessarily want the full reference thrust. And by going from 9,000 to 13,000, which is this should be, that's a 4,000 foot change. So in order to get you there in 2 minutes, flight level change would give you about a 2,000 foot per minute rate of climb. And it would give you the power to maintain that 2,000 foot per minute rate of climb. And that may not be at the full reference thrust. So let's say your full reference thrust is climb, and we're going from 9,000 to 13,000, and you push flight level change. The power is going to increase. The elevator is going to pitch to maintain the speed that's in the indicated airspeed Mach window, which in this case is 250. So the elevator will pitch to maintain the speed, and the auto throttle would adjust the power for the rate of climb to get from 9,000 to 13,000, which it wants to give you about 2,000 feet a minute, half the magnitude of the change. So again, another way of saying that is it attempts to get you there in 2 minutes. So in this case, it would give you about 2,000 feet a minute, and the thrust may not be anywhere close to the reference thrust. It may be somewhere between idle and the reference thrust. Now, if you were going to go from 9,000 to 23,000, okay, so now that's a 14,000 foot change. And if it attempts to get you there in 2 minutes, then it would attempt to give you a 7,000 foot per minute rate of climb to get you there in 2 minutes for a 14,000 foot change. Well, obviously it can't do that. So it'll just go to the full reference thrust, whatever whatever it is, climb 1, climb 2. It's going to go to the full reference. It'll calculate that you want to go from 9 to 23,000, and that's 14,000 foot change. And half of that to get you there in 2 minutes would be 7,000 feet. Well, I can't give you 7,000 feet a minute, but I can give you the full reference thrust. So that's kind of how it figures it in the climb. Again, flight level change will affect your elevator and your auto throttles. The elevator is pitching for the speed, and that's why it says flight level change speed, because speed is a function of pitch. In the case of the auto throttle, it says thrust. It doesn't say thrust reference, it says thrust, and the thrust indicates that it's a variable thrust. It's a variable thrust based on half the magnitude of the altitude changed. Again, in this case, 4,000 gives you 2,000 feet a minute. Yeah, I can do that. The system says I can do that. I can give you enough power to give you 2,000 feet a minute. So the thrust alone, and not thrust reference, simply tells you that it's a variable thrust. A flight level change descent will basically be the same thing in that it's going to affect the auto throttle and it's going to affect the pitch. So you're going to get some indications here that will say, initially it's going to say thrust, but then as the power comes back to idle, the power is removed from the servo motor and the auto throttle will go into hold because it's reached idle. And then it says, okay, I don't need power on the servo motor anymore. I can go ahead and just go to hold. And again, the elevator is pitching for the speed that's in the indicated airspeed Mach window, which is 250. The auto throttle is coming back to idle. And again, it will say thrust initially, but once it reaches idle, it goes into hold. And again, you'll get a green attention box there. And so in this case, if you're doing a flight level change descent, and you're going from 9,000 to 4,000, it really doesn't care about the magnitude of the change, unlike the climb. The climb did care about the magnitude of the change. The descent really doesn't. All it does is it just reduces the power. The nose pitches down to hold a speed of 250. The power will come back to idle, and whatever rate of descent you have, that's what you have. Now, if you require a greater rate of descent, and let's say you're at 250 knots, and it's going down at, in this case, you can see it here, 1,150 feet a minute. It's going down at 1,150. But you need, ATC says expedite down to 4,000, and you're at 250 knots. Well, there's only two things you can do. One would be increase the speed, but you can't really do that because you're 250 below 10, and you'd be violating a regulation. So you can't increase the speed, so the only thing you can do is speed brake. You can bring the speed brake out partially or go to full, and that will increase your descent rate. And if that's not enough, you'd have to advise ATC, yeah, I'm unable to do what you want me to do, in which case they may vector you away or whatever. Now you'll notice I put on the side here 60-40 ratio speed change. This would be if you, let's say we went into a flight level change descent, and you start to, you set the lower altitude in the window, 4,000. You have to do that first, right? You have to set a lower altitude in the MCP, and then you push flight level change up on the mode control panel. And now it says thrust flight level change speed. And then as the power comes back to idle, it'll say hold flight level change speed. But now ATC says slow to 220 knots. So you spin this down to 220 knots. What's going to happen is the elevator is going to pitch to maintain that 220 knots. So, and it's going to go more for pitch than it does for the rate of descent. Let me say that again. It will decrease your pitch to get you on speed more than it will descend. And that's about a 60-40 ratio. So in other words, the elevator is going to pitch up pretty good in order to get the speed slowing down to 220. And your rate of descent will suffer because of that. But once it gets to 220 knots, then the elevator will pitch down again for 220 knots and resume that descent. And it does it goes more for pitch than it does for rate. So it's going to go 60% more to get you on speed and decrease the rate of descent a lot more, if that makes sense. In other words, it's kind of going 60% more to get you on the speed before it resumes the descent. It knows that you want to slow down as opposed to descending. And so we need to slow down more than we do descend. And so it kind of goes for that more. And then once it gets on the speed, then it resumes. You'll see the nose pitch down and the vertical rate will increase and down you go. And again, if that's not good enough, you can use speed brake. And again, when do we use flight level change? We use it for primarily the descent when you're coming off a VNAV type profile. And VNAV really doesn't do anything for you anymore economically because ATC is yanking it around now. Turn left, turn right, do this, do that, descend to this, descend to that. They're vector. So now VNAV is going to be more of a detriment. Because VNAV wants to descend the way it wants to descend, and it may slow up the rate of descent because it's looking at your profile, and you're off the profile now, and so it may be looking at a restraint at 2700 at ABC waypoint, and now it slows down your rate of descent because you're kind of going away from it, and now ATC says, hey, can you descend faster than that? So we will always go to flight level change once you're off the profile. Because they want you down, they want you to get expeditiously get down to that altitude. So the next mode we're looking at is altitude hold. Now, and we said altitude hold is usually an automatic function of capturing an altitude. So it's not something we usually select. It's something that is the result of a pitch mode that goes to an altitude and then it captures that altitude. In this case, we were in maybe a flight level change descent, let's say down to 5,000. Well, this is 5,200, but let's say it was down to 5,000. And we go ahead and capture that 5,000. This would say alt, green attention box, and the auto throttle will go to speed, green attention box. And it's the result of, let's say, descending and flight level change. And so it captured the altitude automatically. Altitude hold basically holds your altitude, just like it says. Alt is an altitude hold mode. It doesn't say altitude hold, it just says alt. You can also add VNAV alt if you're capturing a mode control panel set altitude and you're in VNAV. It would say VNAV alt instead of alt. if you were climbing and we get to the point where maybe you're holding some kind of rate, 3,000 feet a minute up, 2,000 feet a minute up, whatever, and you get to 5,000 feet, and ATC says level off at 5,000, Sonic 44 heavy. There's traffic above you at 6. You could do one of two things. It depends how critical it is. If it's really critical that you get the airplane at 5,000, you could disconnect the autopilot, push the nose over to stay at 5,000, and that may be more advantageous depending on your rate of climb. If your rate of climb is pretty hefty, and let's say ATC comes at you with that call, stop at 5,000, there's traffic at 6,000, and you're just passing through 5,000. Well, if you're climbing at 3,000 feet a minute and you push altitude hold, it'll come back to where you push the button, but it's going to climb quite a bit before it does that. And depending on the magnitude of your vertical rate, it may take some time. It doesn't just plaster people to the wall, or to the ceiling. It does it smoothly. So it's going to kind of continue to climb, level off, and then start the descent back to where you push the button. So it kind of does it smoothly, and that may be a little too close for comfort if somebody's at 6,000 feet. So you would probably, if it's really critical, disconnect the autopilot and just push it over, and safety is more important than anything. But if you had room and he said, hey, I need you to level off at 5, sorry about that, whatever, it's not a critical situation. Altitude hold, where you push the button, it recognizes. And unlike heading hold, it will go to the last push of the button. So if you push altitude hold once, it remembers exactly where you pushed that. And it's going to return to that altitude exactly where you pushed it. Unlike heading hold, which you just roll wings level and hold that heading. So you can see the difference between heading hold and altitude hold. Altitude hold brings you back to where you pushed it. Now, if you push it multiple times, you go push, 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 it's going to remember the last push of the button. Whatever the last push of the button is, that's where it's going to level off. Now, again, do we have to push this very often? No. Typical line flight, you're not pushing this at all because you capture an altitude as an automatic function of climbing or descending in a pitch mode to an altitude, and then you capture that altitude automatically. So again, altitude, the hold button, or typical line flight, you're not using it. But it's there if you needed it. And there could be a time when you need it. But you also have to kind of then weigh, do I want altitude hold if I'm climbing at 3,500 feet a minute and there's traffic above me 1,000 feet? Probably not. Because I'm going to continue to climb up to, in this case, you can see I climbed up to 5,350, but I'm not climbing that rapidly. But, if you're climbing like a raped ape, then at some point, you could climb quite a bit here. Probably not 1,000 feet, but you could climb quite a bit before it starts back down. So again, altitude hold has its uses, but they're very, 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 very limited. Again, we used to use this on non-precision approaches as well, because we would use vertical speed to descend, and then at the MDA, we'd push altitude hold once and then push it again to level at the MDA. But nowadays, we don't, again, non-precision approaches, we use VNAV. And the last mode, we'll talk about a little bit, but we're going to be talking about it more when we do the FTDs, and that would be a VNAV climb. So in a VNAV climb, the auto throttle will, again, you get two changes here. You get a thrust change. Is that showing up? Oops, sorry. Sorry. Let me go back here. I just want to make sure, right? Yeah, there's my pointer. Okay, so you get a thrust change and you get a pitch change. So in this case, it's thrust reference, VNAV speed. Now, VNAV is very, very, very similar to flight level change. But the difference is that the speed is being controlled by the FMC, by the flight management computer, not by us directly. In flight level change, we set the speed. In VNAV, the FMC is going to set the speed unless we intervene on it. The other major difference is that, but you'll notice in flight level change, it said flight level change speed. It said FLCH speed. Here it says VNAV speed. But the main point is the elevator is pitching to maintain the speed that's in the window. And in flight level change, it's a speed that we selected. In VNAV, it will be the FMC computed speed, what the FMC wants to use for the speed. Now the other difference is you'll notice it doesn't say thrust here like it did in flight level change. It says thrust reference. So the difference is that when you're in a VNAV climb, it's going to go to the reference thrust, no in between. In VNAV, it was a variable, in flight level change, it was a variable thrust. In VNAV, it's not a variable thrust. It just goes right to the reference thrust. So it's going to go to climb 1, or climb 2. No in between. It just goes to that, and then whatever rate you have is what you have. And the elevator pitches to maintain the speed. So the two real differences in this VNAV climb scenario is that the speed is controlled by the FMC, unless we intervene. And the thrust is not a variable thrust. It goes right to the reference thrust. Oops. Slower. And you can see that here. And I kind of illustrated that here. Here again, we're going from 9. What happened to my 0? Here, I thought I changed this. Okay, we're going from 9,000 feet to 13,000 feet again. There should be a 0 there. It's a 4,000 foot change. That doesn't matter when you're doing a VNAV climb. You're going to get, this got screwed up here. This should be VNAV speed. Sometimes PowerPoint, when you convert from Keynote, it screws this up. It should say thrust ref, like the other slide did. Thrust ref VNAV speed, all in one line here. And again, when we go into, let's say we're at 9,000 feet and we go into a VNAV climb, it doesn't care about that this is a 4,000 foot change. It doesn't care. It just goes to the reference thrust. So it's going to go to climb 2. There's no variable thrust here. It's going right up to that 87.3. And whatever rate you get is what you get, 1,800 feet a minute. The elevator is going to pitch to maintain the speed, but the speed is being controlled by the FMC. The FMC will control your speed. And if this is a small change, 4,000 feet isn't too small, but if it's a small change, I don't necessarily want this going all the way up to the reference thrust just to change 2,000 feet. That's a case where you might consider using flight level change if it was a small change. But in most cases, in VNAV, we're going up and away. We're not making small changes, and we're climbing to our cruise altitude. And so most of the time, we're climbing in a VNAV climb. So again, two major differences. The FMC controls the speed, not you directly. You're monitoring it, and you can intervene on it, but it's controlling the speed based on what's programmed and what your cost index is and what your weight is and what your, for the best economy. And the auto throttle then is not going to give you a variable thrust. It's going right to the reference, so it goes up to the reference. Those are the two major differences, but very similar, though, to a flight level change climb and how it works. The elevator pitches for the speed, and the auto throttle is controlling your rate. It's just that the rate is going to be the full reference rate, not this taking this into account. You have a couple different kind of level offs. When you're in VNAV, you can level off in VNAV path or VNAV alt. We'll go more into that, and some of you may be familiar with it already. But when we talk about VNAV more, we'll go into that. It just depends whether you're leveling off at a constraint altitude. In that case, it's going to say VNAV path. If there's no constraint, but you're leveling off at a MCP set altitude in the mode control panel altitude window, then it would say VNAV alt. There is no restriction, there is no constraint, but there is an intermediate level off via the MCP. So in that case, it would say VNAV alt. But again, it's automatic that it will level off at that altitude as an automatic function from that pitch mode. A VNAV descent, again, this got screwed up. The VNAV path should be up here, the path, VNAV path. In a VNAV descent, we normally will go from a top of descent point to an end of descent point as programmed on an approach. So when you put in an approach, there's usually going to be an end of descent point. In this case, it's 60 feet above the runway, and that's the end of descent point. And then the computer looks back, the FMC looks back and says, yeah, on that approach you got to cross Toge at 1600. On that approach you got to cross Asagi at 2200. There's a restriction across Payne at 4000. And it kind of constructs this profile, and you're at an altitude of 9,000, let's say. Or it could be, 41,000, whatever. It will then create a top of descent for you based on the best economic profile at idle thrust to stay on a VNAV path. Now, this actually is a path from the top of descent to the end of descent. And it's going to attempt to get you at these points, Payne at 4,000, Asagi at 2,200, Toge at 1,600. And then if you kept VNAV all the way down, it could take you 60 feet above the runway. But again, do we do that? Probably not. Because at some point you're going to be yanked by ATC and vectored, and then you're probably going to come in, like let's say they descend you to, you're approaching Payne, you cross Payne at 4, now they give you vectors. And now they say descend and maintain 2,200, and they're giving you vectors to Asagi. And then you get to Asagi, you come in level at 2,200 to Asagi, and then you pick up the glide slope all the way down now on the ILS. And obviously you're not using VNAV anymore. You stopped using VNAV here. Could you fly it all the way down? Yeah, you could if ATC let you. In a perfect world, if we could do whatever we wanted, we could use VNAV all the way down if we wanted to. Now, obviously, we're going to fly approaches, and then that, we can't do that in VNAV if we're doing an ILS approach. But in a perfect world, if we were doing a non-precision approach, let's say, we could fly it all the way down to 50 feet above the runway if we wanted to, if we were allowed to. So in a VNAV descent, the auto throttle will go from speed, it'll go to idle, and you'll see idle, and then it'll go to hold because the power is removed from the servo motor, and it stays at idle thrust unless the speed decreases, and then it'll come back to speed and get you back on speed. And we'll talk more about the intricacies of VNAV, but for right now, this is what a VNAV descent would look like on a path from the top of descent to the end of descent, taking into account all these constraints and restrictions to compute a path that intersects with your cruise altitude, or your whatever altitude you're at, 9,000 in this case. And then if we're in VNAV, it would cross that top descent point. Assuming we have a lower altitude in our MCP, it would then the thrust levers would come back to idle, and the nose would pitch over to keep you on that path. And now again, it's an optimum path to cross these restrictions, taking into account all the way down your end descent point. You'll notice I say here, it tracks a path from the top of descent to the end of descent. The speed can vary, because it's tracking a path. It actually is on a path. And the speed, let's say it's at 240 below 10, and that's usually what it goes to in VNAV. But if there was an unforecast tailwind, the speed could start increasing here to 245, 250. It can increase. Now, at a certain point, it'll leave the path. We'll talk more about that. But the, if everything's perfect, it's going to stay right on the speed. If your winds and all that stuff that's programmed in are fine, and it calculated the path very well, then at idle thrust, it should maintain that speed. But it could slow down, it could speed up. If it slows down, it could go back into, the auto throttle could go back into speed and get you back on speed. If it gets too fast, and it gets way too fast, it'll eventually leave the path. Unless you intervene to reduce the speed, like add some speed brakes and reduce the speed. You'll get a drag required message and things like that. Now, some of you are familiar with that. If you're not, don't worry about it. And then we'll look at the auto throttle modes of speed and thrust. Speed is usually automatically entered as the result of capturing an altitude. So if you descend or climb in a pitch mode and you capture an altitude, the auto throttle will automatically go to speed. It's nothing we have to push. There are situations where you may have to, but in most cases, you don't have to push the speed button. It's automatic. Thrust is a button that is kind of a mystery button because most people, you don't use it on a typical line flight. But it has its uses, and we saw one that we talked about earlier, and that is changing the thrust from takeoff to climb if you were not using VNAV. Also, if you took off without the auto throttle on, you could re-engage the auto throttle above 400 feet if you push the thrust button. But they're very limited uses, and typical line flight, you're not pushing that button, you're not even seeing that button do anything. But we're going to demo one on next week's lesson. So speed is usually an automatic function of capturing the altitude. So in this case, if we were climbing 8,000 and we're in flight level change and we capture the altitude, we come out of flight level change, you get a green attention box, auto throttle will go into the speed mode automatically, a light bar on the mode control panel would light up and the speeds showing that the speed is selected. But again, this is where we look to confirm that we're in the speed mode. This is what we actually have, is what we have on the FMAs. And it's important to look here. So again, speed automatically captures as a function of capturing the altitude. And then the thrust button, again, not normally used, but it has some limited functions. If you were in altitude hold like we see here and we push thrust, it's going to go to thrust reference, and the power is going to go up to the reference thrust, and there is no speed control now. It's just going to run away. Run away, run away, run away. Now, there is protection so that if the auto throttle gets close to the boxes here, the power will reduce and keep you from overspeeding. There is speed protection. And we're going to be we're probably going to talk about this too as well. I don't think I added this, did I? Let me look for a second. Yeah, the other thing we're going to talk about that I don't think I added are speed protections. The auto throttle protections and the pitch protections that you have in everything except VS. Yeah, we're going to talk about that because I think that's the only time we have time to talk about it. So we'll talk about that in the next lesson too. But see, this is obviously not desired, right? You push that, goes to thrust reference. It goes to the reference thrust climb, and your speed is set down here at 250, and it runs away rapidly now. But there is protection via the auto throttle, and it will protect you from overspeeding. But we obviously don't want that. We want to go back to speed. That's a case where you'd say, whoops, I pushed the wrong button, and now go back to speed. Just push this light bar will illuminate, we'll go back to speed, and then the thrust would come back and the power would come back. Probably before you did that, you probably disconnected the auto throttle and pulled the power back. That's really what you should do. What you should do is disconnect the auto. As soon as you saw that happening, you kind of don't ask why. You take over manually and get it under control and then ask why. So in this case, if I saw that running away and I wasn't sure why it's running away, disconnect the auto throttle from the thrust levers, pull the power back, control the speed, and now figure out what went wrong when you have time. Autopilot, you got 3 autopilots. We said the first officer usually uses the right and the center. The captain will use the left and the center. Again, you can use any one you want, really. It doesn't matter. But for Boeing procedures, we usually use left or center. FO uses right or center. If you're on the center autopilot and you want to get to the right autopilot, you can't just reach up here and push. Nothing will happen. So if you push here, nothing happens. You have to disengage the autopilot and then re-engage another autopilot. And you do that via the control column, push button switch. One push disconnects, another push cancels the warning, the siren, and the autopilot disconnect. Could you disconnect from here? Yeah, you could, but that's not normal. This is a gang bar, and it disconnects all 3 autopilots. So if for some reason the control column didn't work, transport category airplanes like the 747 have to have an alternate way to disconnect the autopilot. And this is it, this disengage bar. So autopilot disconnect, you have to disconnect and then reconnect. So if I were the pilot flying and I wanted the left autopilot in command, I would disengage the autopilot, 2 pushes on the control column, and then I would tell my pilot monitoring, give me the left autopilot command. Because I'm hand flying at that point, and I don't want to reach up and push. That's not my mode control panel to push buttons. That's the pilot monitoring with commands from me. So you'll see a lot of people will disconnect and then they'll reach up there and do it themselves. Technically, not right. Technically, they're hand flying the airplane at that point. When they reach up, they could pull back on the control column, and up goes the vertical speed, and they climb 200 feet. So that's why you should be still flying the airplane, and now you command what you want. Give me the left autopilot command. Auto throttle arm switch is here. Again, if you turn the auto throttle arm switch off. That's a positive off. When you turn it to arm, it arms the auto throttle to come on automatically when you get into a mode that requires the auto throttle. Like if you go into a VNAV climb, the auto throttle is going to come on automatically. The auto throttle disconnect switches are on the back side of the thrust levers on 1 and 4. They're thumb switches. And so the captain's right thumb would push the left auto throttle disconnect switch, and the first officer's left thumb would push the right disconnect switch on the back side of the thrust lever to disengage the auto throttle. This is just to show you where they are for now, how you engage and disconnect. Engagement is usually automatic as a function of a mode. And when do we turn it off? There's certain situations where you may have to turn it off. I'll talk about those now. Then we're going to begin the approach preparations. So we're going to get the weather. Sometimes there's different acronyms for this, but one acronym is ABBBC. ABBBC. EICAS is get the weather. Now that we got the weather and we know the approach in use, we can put the approach in, build the approach. We can select the approach from the arrivals page, do our Y pattern on the CDU, get it set up the way we want it, and then what auto brakes does the pilot flying want? And then, after that, we would brief it. As pilot flying, if the pilot monitoring put in the approach, which he usually does, then the pilot flying would check it before he briefs it, that what he put in is what I want. And, we cross-check each other. And then we brief the approach. And then the final thing is after you brief, you transfer control again. Okay, you have the airplane, I have the airplane, you have the airplane. And then we would do the checklist. And then we would accomplish the descent check and the approach check. And we'll talk about when those are done. So that's kind of how we set up for the approach. The ABBBC, EICAS, put the approach in, do the Y pattern, finish this. It's kind of the CDU pre-flight, if you will, for the approach. And then what auto brakes do you want? And then I'm going to check the CDU if I'm the pilot flying. Make sure everything's in there, he's done everything, and then I'm going to brief the approach while he's flying. Then after that, we'll transfer control back to me, and then we'll do the checklist. Descent checklist usually before the top of descent point, and approach checklist when you get to your transition level. EFIS control panel, we'll talk about some of the functions of these map switches when we do it next week. And obviously this is pretty self-explanatory, most of this, as far as the modes that you can be in: approach, VOR, map, plan, the range, whether in inches or hectopascals, whether in radio or baro, having your flight path vector on, your meters, and then what these switches do. You have an EICAS control panel and you have an EFIS control panel. The EICAS control panel controls what you see on the EICAS display via the engine page, status page, or synoptics, and canceling or recalling messages. And then, of course, the EFIS control panel controls what you see on your PFD, primarily your ND, and PFD. PFD and ND, what you see on there, the EFIS system, the Electronic Flight Instrument System. And then we're going to talk about the alternative operation here when we use that. If the EFIS or the EICAS control panels fail, then we can get into the CDU, and everything we do on the EFIS control panel or the EICAS control panel, I can do through the CDU if that fails. And we also may be able to turn it on, but in some airplanes you don't have that function. And the only way you get this is if it fails. But in some airplanes, like you'll see in the Aerowinks, you can turn it on and actually go in here directly, even though the panel hasn't failed. So we're going to demonstrate that next week. Here's the Y pattern for the setup. The reason we call it a Y pattern is because it does a Y on the function keys of the CDU. So we're going to go departure, arrival key, and get to the arrivals page, select the ILS approach, modify as necessary. Go to the legs page and check it, and then modify as necessary. Check the NavRad page that, it's been programmed, auto-tuned properly, and any other nav aids we want in there, we can put in there. And then a init ref in order to set our VREF 30 speed. So it goes like this. It goes kind of in a Y. And you'll see it here. So we start out with the pushing depart. This has logic. So it brings up the page it thinks we want to look at. In this case, it's Seattle arrivals. That's the correct page. If it's not the correct page, I can go to index here and find the correct page. But this is what I want. I want Seattle arrivals. So now I can select the approach. And I go ahead and select the ILS approach. Let's see if that goes on here. Yeah, so here I selected the ILS 3-4 right. I pushed that R4 line select key. It says selected, execute light comes on, erase prompt comes on. I execute it, and then it'll say active here next to ILS 3-4 right. And then if I've done that, now that I've selected the approach, and I don't need a star, let's say, or anything like that, I could go to the legs page now. Here we are on the legs page, and you can see that we have pane, discontinuity, kneel, buck, the runway, and now I can see, well, what are we doing and how do I need to modify this? So if we're getting radar vectored, outside of kneel, then I could bring kneel to the scratch pad and extend the line into kneel for radar vectors. And we'll show you how to do that if you don't know how to do that. But I'm going to modify this as necessary now, depending on what I'm doing. Then I could go to, once I'm done with legs, I go to NavRad and check the ILS. This would normally say A for auto-tuning, not M for manual, say A here. If it's got an ADF, I could put that in manually. They don't auto-tune. If I wanted to tune any nav aids here, I could. Probably on an ILS, I don't need to. I probably want to leave them auto-tuned. And then the final step is to go to the init ref. So again, we went depart, legs, NavRad, init ref. And now I select my flap 30 speed, 155. Select that to the scratch pad. It comes to the scratch pad, 30-155, line selected into the flap speed line. And then I'm pretty much done with the CDU setup. And then I'd set my auto brakes or tell the pilot monitoring what I want for auto brakes. He'll set it. And then I'll check the CDU and then brief. In the maneuver section, you'll have an ILS approach. You can look that over. Normally, when you're on depending on what you're doing, if you're doing a full procedure, including a procedure turn, then you're going to configure maybe a little differently than you would if you're being radar vectored. So it just depends what you're doing. But ideally, the thought is that you're going to want to, as you approach the area and the airport traffic area, you're going to want to be slowing down from up to 1 to 5. And you're going to want to be somewhere in the vicinity of 200 knots, and not kind of cramming in here at 250. And then as you're vectored for the approach here, if we were vectored, you could either be at flaps 5 or you want to go to flaps 5 as you're on an intercept heading. And then as we're being vectored as we get on the localizer, we're going to want to go to flap 10. Now notice it says flaps 10 optional. That is an optional setting. Some airlines will go directly from 5 to gear down flaps 20. I personally don't like that because I'd rather slow down a little more and use 10 as an intermediate setting. So it's really, does the airline do that or don't they do that, or do they encourage it or don't they encourage it? At Boeing, we typically do use 10 as an intermediate. And ideally, I want to go to flap 10 and set speed and be on speed when the glide slope moves. I'm timing things so that when the glide slope moves, I'm at flaps 10 on speed. That's ideally how I want to be. So I can back up from there and say, well, how do I want to configure myself in order to be flaps 10 on speed before the glide slope moves? And, again, you may have to keep the speed up. It depends on what ATC is telling you to do. And we can certainly keep the speed up and still keep some, either hold the flaps a little longer and keep the speed up for ATC. But in training, we typically, are having people slow down and be configured because they're going to be taking a check ride, and you don't want to be fast and, behind the 8 ball. So you typically, line versus training is two different things, because on the line, a lot of times ATC is giving you a speed. Maintain 200, slow to 180 until 6 miles from the outer mark, and then resume normal speed, or saying, they might give you some instructions, or maintain 180 to the marker and then normal speed. So once the glide slope's alive, we're going to go gear down flap 20. We'd be at, again, flap 10 on speed. We'll arm the speed brakes. When we intercept the glide slope, we'll get our final flap, set flap 30, and we'll set the missed approach altitude, and then we'll do the landing checklist. And we'll talk more about that in detail as we do it. How do we set our speed? Well, Boeing procedure is to put the speed right on the flap maneuver indication. So if we're at 200, and let's say we're 252 knots or 250 knots, and we'd be at 250 really here if we were on the approach, or getting ready for the approach. So let's say we want to start slowing down now. We could slow down to the up bug and not below the up bug with the flaps up. Now some airlines will take this and it just depends on the airline. Some airlines will set up plus 10 and be 10 knots higher than this. Some airlines will take the bottom of the box. Let's see, can you see me? Yeah, the bottom of the box, and put it not touching but right on top of the up indication, and that would be 5 knots higher than this speed, than the up speed. We like to put the up inside the box. You just kind of box it, and that's right at the up indication. So if we want to start slowing down, we would bring it like this. And most airlines in Europe and Asia do this. They put it right on the up bug. And we do at Boeing too. That's because that's how it's taught. Personally, I believe I like better plus 5 or plus 10 because it gives you a better body angle. It's less of a body angle, which is more comfortable for passengers and flight attendants. So, if I had a choice, if it were me, I would say, well, I like 5 knots or I like 10 knots. But the Boeing procedure, and probably what most of the world does, is put it right on the bug, right on the up indication, or right on the 1 indication, or right on the 5 indication. So I can't go any slower than this without bringing flaps out. This is the minimum speed for flaps up. When I'm ready to slow down, I'd say, okay, flaps 1. And now I'd set speed. And I'd set the speed right on the 1 indication. Again, boxing the 1. That's right there. Again, the choices are 5 knots higher. The bottom of the box right here would be on top of the 1. Or bring it 10 knots higher, which is kind of in between here. If you take halfway here, that's 10 knots. Because each 1 to 5 here is 20 knot spread. So halfway would be 10 knots. So if I were to go flap 5 and I'm going to use 10 knots, just set it halfway between 1 and 5. If I'm going to use plus 5 knots, then take the bottom of the box, put it right on top of the 5. If I'm going to do the Boeing procedure and put it right on the 5, then I'll box the 5. But I can't go any slower than this without without calling for flaps 5. That's the minimum speed for flaps 1. Now, when I go flaps 5, then I can reduce the speed to the 5 indication. And this takes the longest, by the way, because flaps 1, it's the mid-span and the inboard coming out, and not the outboard section of the leading edge flaps. And it's just leading edge flaps that come out when you go to flaps 1. So that's pretty quick because it's pneumatics. And boom, they're out almost right away. But when you go from 1 to 5, now the outboard leading edge flap comes out. And now the flaps drive to the 5, the trailing edge flaps drive to the 5 position. That takes a little longer because you're going from up, basically, to 5 on the trailing edge flaps. So this is the longest, even in normal operation. This is the longest that it takes. So some guys will actually pause here a little bit and wait till the flaps kind of start down to 5. Now, there's no problem in bugging this right down to 5 because by the time it gets to 5, they're probably out. But some guys will pause a little bit because that's the slowest. And they'll wait maybe a couple seconds before they bring it down to 5. And again, that's the minimum speed for flaps 5. I can't go below this without going to flap 10. And again, some people will go gear down flaps 20 and go right from 5 to 20. But you see the spread here. We don't have our approach reference speed here, which we should. But the spread here would be pretty big going from 5 to your rough speed, plus 5. So you'll notice that the 10 indication is actually a good intermediate position. And like I said, I like to use it. A lot of airlines use it. But you don't have to use it. That's the point. You could be at 5 and go directly gear down flap 20. There's nothing wrong with that. If I saw a guy do that, there's nothing wrong with that. But we encourage the use of 10 because it slows you down a little more. It keeps you ahead. Things like that where you want to teach guys to be ahead as much as possible on a check and not get behind. So we go flap 10. Oh, I don't show that here. I didn't bring the bug down to 10 here. But then you'd be at flap 10 and you'd be waiting for the glide slope, which we don't have here. But when the glide slope's alive, we'd go gear down flap 20, and then we'd box the 20 and arm the speed brake. And then we'd go flaps 30. We would go ahead and set our bottom of the box right on top of the ref. And not cutting through the ref, but right on top of the ref. And that's 5 knots. You don't even have to figure it out. You just put the bottom of the box right on top of the ref without it cutting through the ref. And that'll be, in other words, ref here is 155, and 160 is our ref plus 5 speed. And if we're using the auto throttle for an auto land, that's fine. But if you're going to plan on manually landing, then you're going to have to, possibly add some wind additives here, depending on what the wind's doing, if you plan on manual thrust. Standard callouts, we can look at those quickly. Let's see. We're just going to look for the ILS approach. Let me switch over here. Here's the standard callouts that we're using for an ILS approach, and they're kind of a modification a little bit of Boeing. I mean, they're close to Boeing, but they're not exactly. Localizer alive, glide slope alive, localizer capture, glide slope capture. Anybody can call that. It's usually the pilot monitoring. But if he misses it, the pilot flying could say it as well. Pilot monitoring is usually going to say the whatever the final approach fix name is, and then the crossing altitude of that fix to check it that you're at the proper altitude. So in this case, you can see I say SIGIO 3900. Pilot flying doesn't have to say anything. He just needs to check it, verify it, that it's the proper crossing altitude. When we get to 1,000 feet above the ground, we're going to call 1,000 feet, instruments normal, missed approach altitude set. Now we're going to set the missed approach altitude at glide slope capture, but we're going to check it right here at 1,000 feet just to make sure it is set. So it's kind of a two-process checking that your missed approach altitude set. Glide slope capture, set missed approach altitude. We'll set it right at that time. But then at a 1,000-foot call, it's going to be 1,000 feet, instruments normal, missed approach altitude set, and we'll just make sure it's set again. We also want to be stabilized. If we're on an instrument approach, we have to be stabilized at 1,000 feet, otherwise we have to go around. 500 feet above the ground, there's usually going to be an auto call out at both 1,000 and 500. But again, we're still going to call it out. We can let the auto call out do its job. It'll say 500, and then we can just say land 3. Or land 2, or no auto land, or flight director, whatever. If we're manually flying, it'd be flight director, whatever the autopilot flight director engaged status is. And the pilot monitoring will call 100 feet above minimums, or the DA or the MDA, you'll say approaching minimums, and then at the DA, we'll say minimums. And then the response from the pilot flying will either be continue, go around if nothing's in sight, or landing, depending on what you see at the DA. On an ILS approach, you could just see the approach lights and you'll say continue. And then when you see the runway, you'll say landing. That could be up to 100 feet. You have to see it by 100 feet, otherwise you got to go around. But you could see the approach lights at 200 feet and continue. So your response here from the pilot flying at minimums would be continue, landing, or if nothing's in sight, go around. The pilot monitoring, when he says minimums, he could also say if nothing's in sight, he could say minimums, no contact. And then right away, I'm verifying and then go around. Go around thrust, flaps 20, positive rate, gear up. We're out of there. So you can take a look at these callouts, but these are the ones we'll be using. Look at those. And on the auto land, here's what happens on the auto land. Below 1,500 feet radio altitude, all 3 autopilots will engage. When we arm the approach, when we push the approach push button, the autopilot that was originally in command stays in command. The other 2 autopilots will arm for engagement. They'll come on if you have that option, and most airlines do. United Airlines doesn't, so when you push the approach button, you actually got to physically reach up and push the left autopilot and the right autopilot to arm all 3 autopilots. But most airlines have where you push it and you get all 3 light bars. And that would simply mean they're armed. One autopilot's in command. The other 2 autopilots are armed for engagement. Then, at 1,500 feet RA, you're going to get land 3, assuming everything's operating. There's lots of checks done at this point. So you got to have 3 radar altimeters, 3 flight control computers, a lot of different stuff you got to have for land 3 to say land 3. And then you also get flare and rollout will appear in white that they're armed. When you get to 500 feet, that's when runway alignment mode starts. If you have a crosswind, you'll be crabbing until then. But at 500 feet, depending on the crab angle, it'll start down to 200 feet, and it'll start taking out the crab and putting the wing down in preparation for a crosswind auto land. And of course, there are limits on how much crosswind the auto land can do. At 50 feet RA, the flare mode will engage and replace glide slope. At 25 feet, the auto throttle will go to idle and replace speed. At 5 feet RA, we'll go into the rollout mode and replace the localizer. And then at touchdown, flare mode is going to blank because it's done. The auto throttle, when you go into reverse, will automatically disconnect, and so that'll go blank. And you're really left with rollout. That's all you have. You have rollout command because the autopilot's still engaged and it's tracking the tuned localizer. And now to leave the runway, you have to disconnect the autopilot. Otherwise, it's going to kind of fight you in trying to get off the runway because the autopilot is tracking the localizer. And so in order to leave that mode, you have to disconnect the autopilot, and now you can take over with steering at that point. So these are the major things that take place during the auto land. And again, we'll point them out as we do the ILS approach. And again, here we are at flaps 10. Glide slope alive, and that's how we want to be. I want to be at flap 10. With the glide slope not showing yet, but about ready to show. And then so as it turns solid and it starts coming down, glide slope alive, gear down flaps 20. Now if the autopilot's engaged, that's all I have to say. And I can go ahead and set the speed, and I can arm the speed brake if I'm the captain. If I'm hand flying the airplane, then I'm going to say what's in white. So if I were sitting here hand flying this and I have a crew member, I would say gear down flaps 20, set speed. And I probably wouldn't say arm the speed brake if I'm the captain because I'm going to do it. If I'm the first officer, I'd say arm the speed brake because he's going to do it. So the thing in magenta is if the autopilot's engaged. The call out in magenta is if the autopilot's engaged. Otherwise, what's in white is if the autopilot were not engaged and I'm manually flying, then I would say gear down flaps 20, set speed. And if I'm the FO, I'm probably going to say arm the speed brake because I'm not going to reach over and do it. It's too awkward for the FO to reach over, especially if he's hand flying, and arm the speed brake. So the captain normally does that. Glide slope capture, or slightly before. I like slightly before, but Boeing says at glide slope capture. Set your final flaps. So it'd be flaps 30, set speed. And you're going to set your missed approach altitude, and then you're going to do the landing checklist. Now again, if the autopilot's engaged, you just say flaps 30. I'll just say flaps 30, landing checklist. That's all I need to say, because I'm going to set the speed, and then I'll set the missed approach altitude, and the pilot monitoring will check it. But if I'm hand flying the airplane, I'm going to say flaps 30, set speed, set missed approach altitude, landing checklist. In our case, it's going to be just what's in magenta because we're going to be on the autopilot. Below 1500 RA, here's what you get. You're going to get rollout and flare armed, and land 3 replaces command. And all 3 autopilots are now engaged at this point. They were armed before when you push the approach push button, now they're engaged. Seeing that? Yeah, okay. So land 3, flare and roll out at 1,500 feet. Runway alignment, again, takes place around this 500-foot point. So, again, if the airplane was crabbed, it'll start to take out that crab. Depending on the amount of crab, we'll talk about that. That's more of a flying thing, so we may or may not talk about that. No, we'll probably talk about it at some point. So runway alignment happens between 500 feet and 200 feet. And there's no enunciation of it, but you'll feel it doing it. Because you'll feel the rudder pedal come in, and you'll see the wing will go down, and it'll come into a side slip in preparation for the landing, which will be again a crosswind landing up to a limit. Flare mode engages around 50 feet. It's actually 40 to 60 feet depending on closure rate. So somewhere in that range you're going to get flare. It replaces glide slope. Again, a green detention box should be around there. And then at 25 feet, the auto throttle will go from speed to idle. And then at 5 feet, you're going to get the rollout mode. Just before touchdown, basically. And then when you land, flare goes away, blanks. When you go into reverse, the auto throttle is going to disconnect. You don't get any cautions for that because it should disconnect. So when you go to, on an auto land, when you go to, when you bring the reversers out, it'll go ahead and disconnect, and this will blank, and you're not going to get a caution for that. And then you're left with this land 3. Well, I said command land 3, and rollout. You're going to get as you're rolling out, because the airplane right now is tracking that tuned localizer, and to get off the runway now you got to disconnect the autopilot, and then you'll be left with when you disconnect the autopilot, it'll say FD, and then you'll just have rollout. And then when we finish up, we'll do our after landing procedure after we're clear of the runway. After landing shutdown, procedure shutdown checklist, secure procedure, that's wrong. Shutdown procedure, shutdown checklist, secure procedure, secure checklist. That should be. And then electrical power down procedure. Okay, that's it for briefing number 2. Do we have any questions? Walter says no sound. Oh, no, that was from before. Never mind. I could see this as being, well, there's no sound this whole time. Any questions from anybody in the room before we terminate? Again, these will be recorded, and it will be put up in the recorded jet streams. It will be edited, so things like my coughing and my, my if I do that a lot, that'll be taken out. So I tend to edit it so it's a little bit better if you watch it then. Okay, thank you for attending, and we will see you next week at Ftd Pc Fs lesson 2 flight. Captain Al out. Leave questions if you think of them later. I'll leave this up for a while.